Namaste and Jai Hind. This is a fantastic conversation. I'm saying it even before we start the conversation, ladies and gentlemen, because sitting across is a person who you just love to hear. He's part of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. He's an author, he's a thinker, he's an academic, and more importantly, he's very, very rooted with what Bharat and Bharatiya actually mean. So let's go back. Sanjeev Sanyal ji, namaste.
Namaskar,
Thank
namaskar.
You. ये तो काफी आपने इंतजार कराया, but I'm looking forward to this. But let me ask you. We'll focus on governance and then we'll evolve this whole aspect. Did we ever have, as a nation, a template for governance? Even if the history and if you go back from the times of, as they say, Satyug, Treta Yug, Dwapar Yug, Kali Yug. And I've read through one of your papers which you wrote on governance, and you tried to figure out, did we have a treatise or a book, or is there a thought continuum? So let's start, let me start by asking you today, is there a thought continuum to our model of governance in this geographical part that we know as Bharatakhanda?
Absolutely. We are, as you know, possibly the oldest surviving civilization in the world. So we have a very long history. And to be a civilized country, you need some theory of governance. And we have experimented with many things. So it's very important to remember that it's not a static thing that we thought up in the beginning and kept doing. It has evolved over time. Their layer upon layer has been added. But a very important part of this entire thinking process is this idea that if there was no state, then the whole world would devolve into a state of chaos called Matsya Nyaya. Where the big fish eat the small fish. It's the law of the jungle.
Law of the jungle.
Now, in the 18th century, European thinkers also evolved a certain idea. If you read Hobbes or Locke, etc., the state of nature, the brutal state of nature. So, this idea that human beings need a framework in which to create civilization is a very old one. So, everything derives then from this idea. Then how then do we create this framework? And there are different views on the matter. So there are different schools of thought. But the basic concept is that avoidance of Matsya Nyaya is the starting point of all Indic thought on the idea of governance. And then different lines of thought are there, which goes back to the epics, then obviously to the treatise, Arthashastra, that Kautilya wrote in the 4th century BC, and so on and so forth.
So I remember reading in comic books and early tales that there were two gurus who had two opposing schools of thought. So one was the guru of the Devatas, the other one was the guru of the Asuras. So that's Brihaspati and Shukra. And somewhere in your paper you also draw the beginnings or the origins of policy making and governance to these two gurus. Is that true?
Absolutely. So first of all, you have to understand that till late into the Puranic age, this idea of the Devatas and the Asuras being good and bad is not true. They are just gods and anti-gods, two kinds of sets of deities who are somewhat in tension. In other societies also, there's similar ideas are there, yin and yang, for example, in the East Asia. And these two lines of thought have somewhat different views of how governance should be done. So there's Shukra, who is the guru of the Asuras, and he has a very stern view of how governance should be done. His view is Danda Neeti, which is the rule of law. So how do you govern a place? You create a set of rules and you, as fairly as possible, carry out those things. And by the way, there is a process of doing it. It's called Nyaya. So it's very important to remember the word Nyaya does not mean justice. It means process. Okay. So Danda Neeti is that there is laws, and then the process of law, then if it correctly carried out, would lead you to governance and consequently civilization. So this is one view. The other view is that of Brihaspati, he is the guru of the Devas. He says, yes, Danda Neeti is important, but we also need active administration. Just having the law, you need policies, you need a more complex system of administration. So his view is you need Varta as well. So these are the two broad thoughts that start out in the beginning, and these are the two gurus. But importantly, you need to understand there are other debates going on simultaneously as well. So even within, for example, Danda Neeti and the law, which both sides agree, there are issues, for example, about should we follow the word of the law or the spirit of the law? And in fact, you can reinterpret the epics as a part of this debate.
Ramayana and Mahabharata?
Absolutely.
Ram and Krishna? Yeah.
So, Ram and Krishna, Ramayana and Mahabharata. Ramayana makes out the case for following the word of the law.
Word of the law.
Okay.
Yeah. What's written, that has to be
yeah,
followed.
whatever is the promise has to be followed, irrespective of whether or not it is just or not. So, Ram's own life is about complying with what is otherwise blatantly unfair laws, I mean, or promises that are, or contracts that have been done. So, for example, his going on Vanvas, right? It is unfair. Nobody thinks it's a fair thing. Even Kaikeyi wouldn't say it's a fair thing. It's just that she has a contract, she's enforcing that contract. But Ram complies. Even though his brother Bharat says, no, you don't need to, I don't want the throne, you can have it back. He says, no, Pran jai par bachan.
Raghukul Reet Sada Chali Aayi, because descendant of Raghu. Yeah.
Absolutely. So, and the whole thing continues. Later on, after the Ramayana, many years later, after the Ramayana has been composed by Valmiki, etc., a full new section is added.
The Uttarakhand.
The Uttarakhand. And there, it is the story of what happens after Ram comes back. And there again, this point is reiterated. The law is that Sita has to be sent away. Ram is not justifying it. He is in fact deeply unhappy. Right? But he has to apply an unfair law. So, Ramayana if it can be interpreted as an argument for the rule of the law as it is been agreed on, irrespective of having the spirit of the law being a part of the conversation. Okay? Now, obviously not everybody agrees with this. Now you have the Mahabharata. Vishnu, as the same God, Vishnu, comes as Sri Krishna as an avatar and makes the opposite case. Okay? In the Mahabharata, Krishna repeatedly does things where the law is slightly twisted.
The word of the law
is twisted. But it's followed, but in a twisted sort of way. But the spirit of the law is better followed. So, for example, during Draupadi's Vastraharan, the law says that if you are the slave of somebody, that person has the right to pull your upper garments off. Okay? Krishna does not debate that. He just makes the sari infinitely long. You see, same thing he is doing repeatedly throughout. So, for example, when Arjun needs to kill the killers of his son Abhimanyu, he makes the sun disappear and reappear by using clouds and tricking them that
into believing that it's sun had set.
Sun had set. Again, the law has sort of been followed, but in a slightly twisted way. But in both cases, note that the justice is better served. So there is a sense of following justice as opposed to simply following the word of the law. So these kinds of, and by the way, this issue of the debate between the word of the law and the spirit of the law has not been resolved even today. Even
which
today,
is right, or which should have more
which should have the
weightage
precedence
now.
is even today debated. So the point I'm making to you is that these are complex debates about governance that was happening even before Kautilya. Everybody knows about Kautilya, Arthashastra, etc. But people don't realize that there were these very evolved and complex debates about governance that were happening even before Kautilya.
So did subsequent rulers and thinkers borrow a little from here, borrow a little from there, and then say evolve a particular treatise or a format?
Absolutely. In fact, Kautilya does it himself.
So what does Vishnugupta Kautilya do?
So
you mentioned that he continued the thought process. That means he had studied the previous thoughts, and it's not that he devised something only on his own, which was his own figure.
Absolutely. This is very, very important to understand that this is a river of thought. And Kautilya, for all his fame, is only deriving from what already exists, and he adds something to it. So this is a school, these are various schools of thought. So here, if you read the Arthashastra, so first of all you have to know who Vishnugupta Kautilya is. We also know him as Chanakya. Very often he is better known for the fact that he founded India's first large empire along with Chandragupta, who was his student, and he was an administrator and all of that. So, but what we are dealing here is with the political philosopher Kautilya, not with the Chanakya, the empire builder.
Empire builder.
This book was probably written, the Arthashastra was probably written while he was still teaching in Takshashila. Like as a manual. Okay. Now, in that manual, if you open the very first page, he starts with salutations to both Shukra and Brihaspati. So, right up front, he is saying, I am paying my respects to these old sages, Shukra and Brihaspati. Okay? Then he goes on to say that there are 4 areas of knowledge that you need to govern a place. So, look at the ones that you need to know. First is Dandaniti. Next is Dandaniti, of course, is rule of law. Varta is economic policy, policy generally, but specifically economic policy. Then you have Anvikshiki, which is a philosophical framework of thinking. So, even today when we have, you debate about socialism, capitalism, whatever, mercantilism, different kinds of economic philosophies, social philosophies. So, he says Anvikshiki. And then he says Trai. Trai, strictly speaking, means the first 3 Vedas, but frankly it means generally the cultural context. So, you can have all the first 3, but applying them randomly is not the issue. You have to apply them in the based on the culture of the place. So, then he says, he tells us which different schools he is borrowing from and what their views are. So, of course, as I already told you, Dandaniti is what the followers of Shukra want. The followers of Brihaspati want Varta, which is policy, and Dandaniti. Then he says, by this point, another school has come up, the school of Manu. So, he says Manu accepts the first 2, but he says that you need to have some philosophical framing to it. But in Manu's case, he says he derives it entirely from the cultural context. So, in Manu's case, he does not distinguish between Trai and Anvikshiki. And then you have Kautilya himself, who says, no, you need to understand all of them.
Okay.
They are all, I mean, obviously they are linked, but they need to be understood in their own right. So, he separates out Anvikshiki from Trai and says all 4 need to be studied. So, this is how he then begins to present a case for how a governance needs to be done and Matsya Nyaya needs to be kept at a bay.
So how does that evolve when it comes to a policy framework? Now, how does, say, culture or religious belief influence economic policy? How does it, a philosophy that this land or this Bhukhand has, what kind of philosophy will impact economic policy? Because that
so these are all linked. So, let me show you how, supposing you had, so for example, he would have thought Dandaniti, let us say. Okay. Now, let us say Kautilya came to India today. He looked around and let us say we told him, okay, you are the great Kautilya, why don't you fix India today? So, how would he use these 4 schools of thought to fix India of today? So, the first thing he would have done is be utterly shocked with our judicial system. Okay.
Why do you say so?
Because he says that the first role of the state, any state, not just the Indian state, of any state, is the dispensation of justice and the enforcement of contracts. Okay. Even the Ramayana and Mahabharata may debate about word of law, spirit of law, but they are still talking about enforcement of law.
Yeah, and what's promised must be delivered.
Yeah. We unfortunately have a judicial system which has 50 million cases stuck in it. Tariq pe tariq, right? So, he would say that if there is one first thing that he would fix is this. He would begin to fix this hole in the role of the state. First thing he would do. Next, he would say, okay, Varta is also important. So, in the case of Varta, we need to think through what is it that the administrative machinery does. And here, there is a particular thing that you have to understand about Kautilya's view of administration and policy. He is extremely suspicious of government officials. Okay? Very, very suspicious. He says, just like you cannot tell how much water a fish is drinking while it's swimming around, you cannot tell how much money a government official is siphoning off.
This is Kautilya.
Kautilya himself says this. Then he goes on to say that, for example, all his policies, you see, everybody knows that he's got these spies and he has this system of information that he has to keep track of people. For the most part, this is not keeping track of average citizens. He's not looking at a police state, as people sometimes think. No. Most of it is firstly against enemies of the state, like foreign powers, etc. But internally, most of it is to keep track of his officials. So most of his information systems, spies, etc., is about officials of the government. Why is he so? He's continuously suspicious of them. So, for example, he says, on our highways, we need to make sure that our highways are protected from the following people. One is highway robbers and gangsters and so on. Secondly, from stray cattle. Then, thirdly, from the nobility and sons of the nobility.
The VVIP mentality.
VVIP mentality. And finally, from government officials who are extracting rent and bribes. Now, imagine this looks, even today, you can, you have all kinds of gangsters.
This is nearly 2,000 years ago.
Yeah. We have stray animals running around on our highways. Yeah. We have badly behaved VVIPs not paying toll and doing all kinds of things and our highways. And of course, you have, government officials trying to sort of extract rent. It has improved now thanks to GST. You don't have those state boundaries and octroi and all, but still these things happen. I'm trying to show you how he was also thinking about these issues. And similarly, you can go on to talk about Trai and Anvikshiki. Even today, we have these big debates about what is the philosophy of framework of philosophy. I mean, should we be welfarist? Should we be socialist? Should we be capitalist, market-oriented? Should we be mercantilist? If we are, should we be libertarian? There are all these philosophies. What and are they meaningful to apply them to Indian context? Okay. For example, what may be considered.
But is there an Indian philosophy? I'm interrupting you. But is there an Indian core Indian philosophy which perhaps is different from this? Is there a socio-capitalistic or quasi-welfare but largely wealth generating?
So there are two things. First of all, the general framework of thinking which Kautilya presents, and then what Kautilya personally prefers. What Kautilya personally prefers is a state which is not welfarist at all.
Okay.
Kautilya is not a welfarist.
Okay.
Okay. He believes the role of the state is to enforce contracts. It is to do internal security. It is to do external security. It is to make sure that commerce flourishes. So yes, he encourages, but he also regulates commerce. He's severely weights. If somebody is cheating on weights and measures and all of this, regulate it. Interestingly, he is against prohibition.
Okay.
So he says that it is better to regulate a social bad, rather than to ban it. Okay. So even for example, prostitution. He allows for prostitution.
So he will disagree with prohibition in Gujarat, in Bihar, the way it is currently.
Yes, he would say that it is better to regulate them than to ban them. So generally speaking, he is a pro-regulation as opposed to banning of things. And so that is how he kind of thinks about these issues.
But is he?
And very importantly, he is not a welfarist in the sense that he is not trying to so his view of how to help the poor, etc., would be the following: that if there is a major catastrophe, a big natural disaster, etc., those are circumstances where the state has a role. Okay, so the state does have a role in helping the poor, etc., but it is in this sense, help them by creating the infrastructure, creating commerce, by providing a safety net during natural disasters.
Right.
Okay, say if there's a famine, you make sure that you're distributing food and so on. So those are the circumstances where, but he's not a welfarist in the, say, Ashoka sense of the word.
He says कि मैं तुमको दूंगा.
So this is actually quite interesting because 2 generations from Kautilya, okay, so Kautilya is from the Chandragupta's era. In fact, he was Chandragupta's guru. So in his 2 generations later, you have Ashoka in Chandragupta's grandson, and you can clearly see Ashoka is creating a different philosophical framework for his empire. So in his edicts, okay, Ashoka is saying, I am the father of my people. So it's clearly, okay. He then says, I have handed over my people to the Dharma Mamtas and the Rajukas, who are government officials, in the same way that a mother hands over her child to a wet nurse. So there is a clear conception of a Mai Baap Sarkar here. Okay.
मैं सर्वस्व हूँ और तुम सब
हाँ, तुम लोगों को बताएंगे हम लोग. Now, Kautilya would have been absolutely shocked by this. Okay. So this, first of all, this this business of dharma mahamantas going and interfering in people's lives. After all, who are dharma mahamantas? They are basically religious police. And they will turn up. They will tell people what to eat, what to do, how to dress, on which day to castrate the bull. All of these things are what the dharma mahamantas do.
Okay.
Kautilya would have said, "What? Are you crazy? You are allowing essentially Inspector Raj. These fellows are corrupt. They are going to go in there and interfere with people's life. More importantly, they will very quickly create a system of large-scale, small bribe and rent seeking." So Kautilya would have been horrified by Ashoka. And in fact, many of the things he was scared of happened. So during Ashoka's rule, remember what happened. Ashoka, by the way, is not the designated crown prince. He kills the crown prince, he kills all his brothers, captures the state. And then he does this, creates this rather Mai Baap Sarkar. And while he is alive, that is what the evidence is, he creates an overblown state, bloated state. And that state collapses while he is on his deathbed. So while he is alive, there is a major fiscal crisis already.
So he's taken a rich, vibrant nation under the first two emperors.
And Ashoka captures the throne
and taken it into
and takes it into fiscal ruin. Exactly what Kautilya had warned you against, overextending the state. Okay, and so the Mauryan Empire is already collapsing while Ashoka is alive. There are already invasions of the Indo-Greeks and other Central Asians in the northwestern frontier. There are already major dissension in his own court. One of his queens are fighting amongst themselves and so on. So already, an overextended Mauryan state basically cannot deal with this expansion and collapses.
So Mai Baap Sarkar is not a British or a,
Nehruvian construct. No.
Post-Azadi construct.
No, it's not a post-Azadi construct at all. The Mai Baap Sarkar has a long history in India as well. And the problem with this is very obvious, because Kautilya is creating what is in some ways a very strong but limited state. Everybody loves a weak and pervasive Ashokan state. So when we become independent, we opt for a weak and pervasive Nehruvian state. And guess who Nehru considers to be his intellectual lineage? It is Ashoka. So Ashoka is actually not considered a great king in the Indian tradition at all. Okay, Ashoka is mostly remembered as Chanda Ashoka, Ashoka the Cruel in the Indian tradition. It is his grandfather, Chandragupta Maurya, who is considered the great king in that dynasty. Maybe his father as well. Ashoka himself is not considered a great king in the Indian tradition. In fact, he is almost forgotten. He is mostly remembered in other countries where he had sent Buddhist missionaries. But those countries had never been under Ashokan rule. So they remember him fondly because, well, he sent them Buddhist missionaries and so on. But not the Chinese, not the Sri Lankans, not the Burmese, they were not under Ashokan rule.
But
the people who were ruled actually by Ashoka did not have a positive view of Ashoka at all. In fact, if you go to Bhubaneswar, just outside Bhubaneswar, there is a hill called Chandragiri. There is a inscription there by a king called Kharavel. And Kharavela was a Uriya king, king of Kalinga, who proudly proclaims that he destroyed the Mauryan Empire. So the Mauryan Empire is not remembered with love and affection by the people of India, and certainly not the people of Kalinga. And so very quickly after Ashoka, the empire collapses. The southern parts of it go off to the Satavahanas. Kalinga rebels and taken over by Kharavela's dynasty, and northern India a little bit later is taken over by the Shungas.
So now there are two parts, Sanjeevji. One is the Mai Baap Sarkar bit, which you say that the Nehruvian state adopted and they glorified Ashoka. But immediately after the collapse of Ashoka, the Satavahanas, the Kharavelas, and the other kings came into play. Did they continue the economic model of Vishnugupta Chanakya? Was there a theory which said, okay, this worked, let's continue this model? Because Bharat was a rich bhukhand and a huge contributor to global economy till at least the 14th, 15th century.
So one of the important things we've got to realize that we are dealing with long periods of time. And many things are happening along the way. The information we have about how exactly these empires functioned and ran, etc., is patchy. Sometimes they're better, some places they're not. So, you know, we'll have to be generalizing in many places. Nevertheless, I do find quite interesting things. So, many of the ideas of Kautilya clearly stayed alive, because in subsequent centuries you have other writers who write. So, for example, in the Gupta period, you have Kamandak.
Yeah.
Okay, Kamandak is also a philosopher from the Gupta period. Guptas are obviously a prosperous empire and so on. And look at how the continuity is maintained. So, when Kamandak writes his treatise or Neeti Sutra, he, just like Kautilya mentioned the earlier things, Kamandak mentions Kautilya.
Okay.
So, clearly,
so then the river of thought.
The river of thought is still there. Now, Kamandak is quite interesting. By and large, he's very, very appreciative of whatever Kautilya is doing. He keeps praising him, he says this, that. But that doesn't mean that he doesn't have certain things where he is somewhat different. Okay. So, there are some things which at Kamandak is different. First of all, Kamandak seems to be a little more welfarist than Kautilya. Okay. So, obviously, Ashoka did have some impact. So, maybe Kautilya's rather severe approach was thought to be maybe a bit too extreme. So, obviously, Kamandak is trying to soften it a bit. That's one possibility. The second interesting point is Kautilya is a little bit suspicious of you know, these princes and things, because remember, he's a first generation empire builder. Kamandak seems to be, we don't know exactly when he existed, but Kamandak was probably at the time when the Gupta empire was well developed. Okay, so he is not in the first generation era. So Kamandak, for example, likes well-born nobility. Whereas, you know, that sense doesn't come through in Kautilya. Kautilya, in fact, picked up somebody like Chandragupta, who was not either. He was certainly not a first layer prince,
aristocrat or somebody.
Aristocrat. Yeah. Even if there are some legends suggest that he may have been a son of the king by a concubine. There are others which say he came from an ordinary family. Whatever it was, he was not elite. And Kautilya himself was quite happy to take somebody like that and put him on the throne and build an empire around him. Whereas Kamandak is clearly from a much more established thing. So he has this preference for sort of an established elite. So you can clearly see these subtle differences in all these things. So even those who are extolling somebody before, it's not like they are just blindly carrying on. They are also massaging it in their own direction.
Now, Kamandak and all of them find a continuum of river of thought, and you've jumped in your paper to the 19th century and to Madhav Rao, the Diwan.
But before I get to Madhav Rao, there is, even after Kamandak, the thoughts are evolving.
Oh, okay.
So don't come to the 19th century yet. So you have to understand that while one is this, the theory of governance, but you see prosperity is coming from other things, from trade and so on. So there are other areas of economic and intellectual thought that are evolving as well.
So this temple economy? No, sorry, please complete.
Yeah. So for example, you have corporate structures developing. Okay. Guilds. Okay, so now many things which you call castes today, they're actually guilds. European guilds, India also has guilds. And they are quite large corporatized things. So when you think India, you know, great economic power, in the first millennium we were 33% of the world economy, etc. So this is not individual heroic ships going one back. We would not have been such a dominant power with that. We became a dominant global power because we had industrialized and mass scaled these ancient production techniques. And who were doing this? They were these corporatized guilds. They're like modern companies almost.
Okay.
Some of them are called, got fancy names like the 500. Okay. Why? Presumably because they had 500 shareholders. And they are not just in India, they are multinational. So you find evidence of them in Southeast Asia and other places as well. So they have, you know, corporate offices in other places. They have their own navies to protect themselves against the pirates. And you will get a sense that they are powerful enough that dynasties come and go, but these guilds remain. So clearly the kings don't mess with them. And they have this relationship with these temples. So there are these huge temples that emerge in the medieval period. So if we go back to Kautilya's period, the temples are not very important. Okay, they're probably not much bigger than village shrines and so on. Maybe there were some royal shrines, but they're shrines. They're not important in their own, you know, big.
They're not economic centers.
They're not economic or even major cultural centers.
Cultural centers, beacons.
Yeah, you're big centers. But by the medieval period, they are, right? Now you have these huge temples, temple towns, and so on emerging. Now the question is, why were they so powerful, and why did they have so much gold?
Correct.
And I keep telling people, it's not because the kings were handing over their gold to these temples. Indian politicians, even in those times, would not be handing over their gold to any temple at all. They would build a few large temples because, yeah, it expresses their power and grandeur, etc., of their dynasty and so on. But they are not handing over their money to anyone. The reason the temples had so much gold is because they were the banks. And they were the guys financing these guilds. The merchant guilds sailing across the seas, the artisan guilds that were doing all this production. They were financing infrastructure, financing municipalities. Even the kings were getting financed by them. So they were very powerful. That's why the gold was there. So they were basically doing banking, venture capital, and a lot of this unfortunately got destroyed, but there are even today some remains of copper plate contracts between a bank and, you know, you'll know the interest rate at which they charge these guilds sailing out. So economic theory is not just about this, economics is not just about this, what the state does and governance. There is also all this other thing. Even today, when we think of economics, it's not just about what the rules of the state and policy. There's also SEBI, there are the banks, there is RBI, monetary policy, there is all kinds of other activities, there is the whole corporate structure, India, corporate India. So there also this all exists, and all of this requires theory.
Right.
Okay. So there was an underlying understanding of how these things worked, and we created very complex systems which eventually payment systems. I mean, for example, if you're trading between, say, Gujarat and Oman, there would be merchants on both sides, and there would be promissory notes going back and forth. And it's not just with Indians. Indians were trading with the Middle East. They had, for example, the Jews had a network. That network extended to India. And similarly, Indian networks extended to the Middle East. Similarly, Indian networks extended all the way through to East Asia, not just Southeast Asia, but East Asia. So there were Indians living in China.
Wow.
And we have remains of their temples. They're Tamil-style temples from the Pallava Chola period in the east coast of China, even today.
So Navy was quite active. Our naval
the Navy was active. There were merchants. Many of these
using
had
the
their own
routes,
navies.
sea routes.
Yeah, there were these sea routes. So some of them were run by the kings who were sending out merchants. But very important part of it is these guilds who had their own navy.
And this trade was not necessarily for one Rajya. It was done for this entire...
Yeah, there are all kinds of kingdoms, networks. It's a very complex system.
So they worked for everyone. So now how did that model evolve? And why is it that this model was not chosen, but the Mai Baap Sarkar model was chosen during the Nehruvian state? And then we'll come to the 19th century, Madhav and also Sayaji Rao Gaikwad.
So it depends a lot of how the thing evolves. So what happens is, first of all, by the end of the 12th century, early 13th century, this whole ecosystem of complex system of guilds and so on gets a major shock. And it happens because, of course, India gets invaded by the Turks, and all these temples get raided. So imagine that's, it's not just the fact that it's a religious cultural shock in terms of our temples getting raided, all the gold be taken. It's a major financial shock. Suddenly the financial basis of this of this entire system is drained away. And at the same time, the people we are trading with also have this shock. So about the same time, the Mongols conquer China and completely devastate there. The Mongols also invade Baghdad and smash, the Middle East. So there's chaos everywhere, and so this entire economic system that I described to you basically breaks down. Okay, and then other systems are built. For a little while, the Arabs try to build a system. Then the Europeans turn up and create the colonial system. And then, of course, we become independent and we create our own system. But by the time we create our own systems, these old systems are left in very little bits and pieces here and there. For example, the Kachi merchants of Gujarat have bits and pieces of the old system still somehow alive. They still have these Goswami monasteries which are still financing their trade in the old way, and they're still going out to Middle East or places like Oman. But they are very small bits and pieces. You know, they are these Indian bankers in Southeast Asia, places like Vietnam and Burma and so on, and they are sort of using the colonial networks and other networks to go out there and try and sort of re-establish the old system, but in a very small scale way. Now we become independent. Now one choice is to go back to re-establishing the old systems, but by this time the framework in which we do this already has a political class, particularly Nehru, who is suspicious of all of this. He wants what he thinks is a modern system based on Soviet and socialist systems. That doesn't mean that everybody agrees with him. So at the time of independence, you have the constitution being written, then there are long debates about all kinds of issues. So the word secularism, for example, is refused. Socialism is refused. Because it is seen to get in the way of an evolving system.
Or for a nation to adapt based on its age, at what age,
at what time. And also, not stated Meha, but there were already existing systems even at that time. So you have, for example, Rajaji. He makes the case that all this socialism, these 5-year plans will create a license permit Raj. He's not saying this in 1980s or 90s when the system has clearly become unworkable and collapsed. He's saying this in the 1950s when the system is being built. So this idea already exists in the 1950s that this is not workable. The first constitution has very strong protection for property rights, for example. And in the very first amendment, we dilute it. First Amendment dilutes freedom of speech and expression. And by the 70s, we have already inserted the word socialism into our constitution, which wasn't there in the original constitution of the country. So this 4.5 decades of socialism embeds into our system new kinds of ideas, which are actually not indigenous at all. But Nehru realizes that he has to create a lineage for it. So what he does is, in the 19th century, he had discovered Ashoka as a great king, but it is really in the early 20th century when sort of socialist thinkers in the 1920s and 30s basically latch on to him as a proto-socialist welfarist of the past and try to build him up. Right? Similarly, they kind of take hold of Akbar and they use Dini Elahi or something to become a proto-secularist, which are both absurd. I mean, you have to read about the sacking of Chittor by Akbar. I mean, clearly not a particularly secular act. But you see, what they are doing is they are inserting into our system certain kinds of ideas and they are trying to deliberately create lineage for it. Okay, so Ashoka, Akbar, these are adopted as kind of to justify whatever they wanted to do.
So pick out a relevance or a reference from the past, glorify it and say, oh, we are following that.
Hum log to hamesha, we were always
like this.
So, this is the essence of being Indian, is Ashokan. Why? Because see, he was very peaceful, he became pacifist. Whereas in fact, there's nothing in his edicts to suggest that he was a pacifist. In fact, he was a Buddhist several years before he invaded Kalinga. And he carried out genocide there. and none of the edicts he has in Kalinga mention any regret at all. His regret for this Kalinga thing is mentioned in an edict which is now in Pakistan. And in that also he mentions that notwithstanding what I did in my regret for what I did in Kalinga, if you forest tribes behave badly, I'll do the same thing to you. Okay. And then we have other texts like Ashoka Vadana, etc., which mentions the massacres he carries out of Jains, of a cult called the Ajivikas in Bengal and so on. There are many other things he does. So it's not at all obvious he becomes a pacifist at all.
So now do we have a template on governance? Let's talk about today.
Yeah.
If Kautilya were to come today, you said, one, he'll be appalled by the state of the judiciary.
Yes.
But he was the one who identified that the courts have to be separate. Raja does not dispense justice. The courts
No.
do.
So in the Kautilya system, this separation is not very clear. There are probably judges. But the king remains the last court of appeal. So this separation is not done in this way. And so there are systems in India where this separation is done. It is up to a point. But the king or the Raj Purohit or the Raj Guru or some such person in the court is kind of would be the pinnacle of the system. But ultimately the king is the king.
King is the king.
And he has to comply with dharma.
Yeah.
Some conception of dharma, and that can evolve with time. But as an institution, this separation is not all that well established at the pinnacle of the system. The ultimate court of appeal, by and large, remains either the king himself or some high official of the court.
So would he be okay with the CBI being put under house arrest by the state police, like it happened in Bengal?
No, that Kautilya would not be happy with that at all, because he has no sense of humor about the hard state. He wants a limited state, but a hard state. But this separation that we have gone for begins to happen in a more formal way under British rule. So in some ways, we then in the 19th century began incorporating certain ideas which are European ideas. Whether they are good ideas or bad ideas is a different issue, and there are something to be said about their way of doing things as well. So not everything we don't have to incorporate everything that is indigenous.
So let's go back to Dandaniti, Varta, Anvishaki and our Trai. Now in our philosophy, do we have a governance model?
So now you see, you have to understand that it's a river of thought.
Correct. So what should be our governance model?
So today we cannot just say, see, because Kautilya said something, because Shukra says something, we have to comply with. These are things they evolved as thought. We can certainly borrow from them. We can use the experience of our history and of world history to develop forward. Even the 45 years of socialism is a part of our history now. We learned certain things from it. So I would argue today we need to learn from all of this, and my view is that by and large, roughly speaking, I would argue that the intuition that Kautilya has, that we need a strong but limited state, is broadly correct. Okay?
Strong but limited
Limited state. So one important thing to understand is that Kautilya is not some libertarian. Okay, he has no sense of humor in those areas where he believes the state should exist. Okay, so if he thinks that the state should exist in, say, internal and external security, he will have no sense of humor about anything. He can be quite severe and, in fact, rigid about these things. But he will be very uncomfortable with extending the state beyond certain boundaries, giving too many powers to the bureaucrats, for example. He is very uncomfortable doing this. Today, we may consider some of his ideas a bit too severe. While he doesn't explicitly put out an anti-welfarist view, but we may find
will he be okay with Ayushman Bharat? Will he be okay with food security?
Yes.
Will he be okay with
so here we don't know.
Yojana,
so he would argue that some support is good, but perhaps only during periods of
calamity
or some kind of stress. So I think he would be perhaps okay with Ayushman Bharat because it's a safety net. Okay, because I think his view would be that do not allow the state to intrude day-to-day life, but the state has a role when there is some calamity. He states it in terms of natural calamities and plagues and so on, but I think it could fit in something like Ayushman Bharat. Yeah, it's a personal calamity. I get cancer, I need to be supported, the state has a role. I think today if he existed, he would accept that. Kautilya would be okay with safety net idea of welfare.
Welfare, okay.
But he would be very uncomfortable with something like UBI. Yeah, a generic spreading of the net of
whether you want it or not, I'm giving you a dole.
Yeah, he would find this idea very, very difficult. Yeah.
So today, on a day when we speak, we've had multiple issues. We've had the leader of opposition portraying a different picture of our country. There are economic forces who are pushing a particular narrative. We have regional flux because there's issue happening in Bangladesh. There's issue happening. We got two borders which are active and hot. What do you think is going to solve it? Is economic heft going to answer certain issues? Should we, as a polity, as a people, subscribe to a governance model and stick to it no matter what? That is rooted in our cultural philosophy, which does not take umbrage to the Prime Minister and the Chief Justice of India doing Ganesh Aarti together? Or would you believe, no, this is not done, we should have clear lines? And
so I think, this is a river of thought. We have learned many things along the way, so I am not rigid about it. But I do think that some amount of rootedness, i.e. Trai, is needed. Eventually we have to function in a particular society. So the social contract, every society depends on certain kind of social contract. Now, the understanding of that social contract is ultimately cultural. It has to be rooted. Now, it doesn't mean it's unchanging or that it has to be rigid about it, but I do think that it has to have some amount of cultural rootedness. Otherwise, a society that is purely legalistic would not be able to function for very long. So, for example, even the European Union, which is a very legalistic kind of union based on kind of contracts and treaties and so on, ultimately at its roots there is a conception of European civilization. Even the US is based on some conception of Judeo-Christian values, and they say so explicitly.
Yeah, the president swears on the Bible.
Yes.
Our Prime Minister takes oath on the Constitution.
Yes. So there has to be a conception of Trai, which Kautilya in fact explicitly talks about. That doesn't mean that Trai is rigid, or that we have to go spend all our time trying to figure out how did Kautilya define Trai. Trai can evolve, but Trai is important. A rootedness, cultural rootedness of some kind is important because it is intrinsic to our understanding of what the social contract is. So otherwise, you see, if you create a...
So should there not be a common code for all these kind of contracts?
Absolutely. So if that is our social contract, if today's social contract is based on equality for all, then everybody should have the same law. I agree with you.
So, because didn't Vishnugupta also talk about a common code?
Not quite. Vishnugupta doesn't quite talk about common code. I think he talks about certain sets of laws that he puts out. My understanding, and I can get into it, that a significant part of Indic lawmaking, particularly at the lower levels, was local. So the word dharma is quite vague. When you say dharma, it does not mean adherence to some dharma shastra. In fact, these dharma shastra didn't even exist at the time of Kautilya. So dharma is a much more generic term in which the first three Vedas provide a very broad framework
of sustenance, of holding society together.
It's like an operating system. It is not the specific app. Okay, the app is local. It depends heavily on local custom, local understanding of things. Maybe a caste or guild may have certain internal rules. So it is left largely to local understanding, with certain override features given at higher levels of you could make your way up to the king if necessary. But by and large, local custom is a very important part of how this is the diversity of India is dealt with. Providing just the three Vedas are just provided as a general framework at best. Some certain conceptions of dharma and what is right or wrong, which is there also. The epics also provide it. But they provide certain ways of thinking. So they are process. Okay, that's why I keep coming back to the point about Nyay does not mean justice. Nyay means that the process of law was followed. Okay, but what the law itself is not defined. Okay, other than this in this generic sense. And the Dharma Shastras were never codes of law. Manu Smriti is a Smriti, it's just a tradition. It is not Manu Shruti.
Yeah.
It is Mani Smriti, it's a tradition.
Tradition. And after Manu Smriti there was
There are others, and
so
there is no
yeah.
kingdom in history where Manu Smriti was the code. It is the British, in their attempt to codify Hindu law, that brought out these things that tried to give them a position they never had. Much of what was Hindu law was customary law. Okay, under the general framework of the Vedas and various other ways of thinking. But the whole thing was about the process of law. So when you say Nyaya Pranali, the process of law. So when you say that I have been given Nyaya, it does not mean that a particular law was followed. No. It just means
the due process
that the due process of law, there is a system of evidence, there is a system of logic. That's why there is a school of in Indian philosophy called Nyay philosophy, which deals with the system of logic.
Okay.
So that through a system of logic, certain kinds of evidences were used. Based on that evidence, a certain kind of system of inference, and that process was followed, and you were given that due.
Final two questions. Between word of law and spirit of law, what should we lean towards in the current structure?
Look,
when we look at governance.
Look, you cannot win in this battle. Even the Ramayana and Mahabharata were not able to resolve it. And so, in both cases, there is fuzziness. Okay. In the case of Ram, he followed the law. But he himself, by the way, lived in utter misery. Ram Rajya is not a place where the king lives in happiness. In fact, he pines for Sita but his people are happy.
Yeah.
So what is Ram Rajya? It is not a place which is a utopia. Ram Rajya is a place where the rulers apply the law to themselves. Where the rule of law is there, the word of law is applied. Even when the king himself is unhappy about it, he has to apply the law. That is what Ram Rajya is. It's not utopia. Right? So that is the first point being made. And the same thing is true of Krishna. Okay? He tries in many ways to stop the war.
Correct.
He tries to do the right thing, but in the end, he's unable to stop the war. The war happens. Right? And all the devastation that he tried to avoid happens. Right? So this is the point I'm making, is that in both cases, the epics that make the case also are very conscious of the limitations of their lines of thought. Okay? So this debate was not resolved between the Ramayana and Mahabharata, and this debate cannot be resolved in any way, because in a sense it is a case-to-case basis. Certain places the rule of law has to be done the hard way. Some point you have to do, but if you did everything by spirit of law, you'll get into some fuzzy debate about what is the spirit of law. So you have to go back to the word of the law. This is not a debate you can resolve. Okay, because in the end, every contract is by definition incomplete. By the way, in economics, there is a whole area of study called incomplete contracts. Okay, and the point being made is, because we live in this fuzzy, complex world, where there are infinite states of the world into the future, it is not possible to write a contract which is complete. Therefore, any contract you write, if you hang around long enough, will end up in a situation which you had not envisaged. Okay? So, in that situation, what do you do?
So you have to resolve or look
You
past
cannot
it.
resolve
So that's
it.
where the
So
fuzzy
therefore,
part
either the word of the law or the spirit of the law, one of them will end up getting violated. And that's why you need a good judicial system.
And that's where you come
which
back
will
and
apply the sensible, presumably the sensible thing.
Now,
Yes.
the other aspect, should we be a wealth-driven nation focused on the creation of wealth, or should we be a welfare-driven state? Because governance will also impact based on what our philosophy is.
No, so there are many things, it's not just a debate between wealth and welfare. There are many other things. There are, there are those who would think that the purpose of the state is to achieve some sort of a moksha or dharma or some balance or all kinds of other sort of motivations that the state may want to have. And interpretations of all of them. So, Kautilya in his Arthashastra, of course, making the case that economic welfare is the root of other kinds of welfare. So, you first have to be rich, then you can do all the other things. And if you're not wealthy, then you cannot even have security because you can't pay your army and so on. You cannot have all the other things. That's what he would say because he's coming from a very economic background. But there are others who have other things. I mean, Ashoka, for example, view is that the promotion of dharma is, in fact, he's not even trying to promote welfare. That's our interpretation afterwards. He's actually trying to promote some conception of dharma. You can agree or disagree with it, but of what he meant by dharma. But he's trying to promote certain kinds of way of life.
But Ashoka's model led the state into penury.
Yes.
Kautilya's model led into a
so
strong
I am
state.
Obviously a Kautilyan, so I have my sympathies to the Kautilyan line of thought.
So
I am very suspicious
unless we are economically strong, do you believe we can safeguard our borders? We can tell our neighbors to behave?
We first and foremost have to generate wealth. Even if we want to do welfare, we have to first and foremost generate wealth, and we have to protect the wealth generating part of the system because everything else depends on it. Secondly, I myself am sympathetic to certain kinds of safety net kinds of welfareism, which I think if Kautilya had existed today, he would have also accepted. I mean, he certainly accepts, providing safety nets from natural calamities. So it's just an extension to the idea of Ayushman Bharat and so on. It's not intellectually a break from him. But I think he would have been very uncomfortable with many of the freebies.
Yeah. So the Revdi culture and also the next aspect of who are the people who will create wealth for the nation, that will be the next conversation. So I exact that promise from you that you will give us time very soon to speak on the way forward on this road to a Viksit Bharat.
Happy to do that. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you so much.